Hello and welcome to another episode of The Issues with Nate Markham. In this episode, I'd like to talk about the top 3 problems with democracy. Democracy is the world's foremost political system. Over half of the world's countries use democracy to operate their socioeconomic institutions. However, these democracies vary widely in quality. Many democracies are flawed and have all sorts of problems impacting the lives of the people negatively. In this video, I will talk about what I think are the top 3 problems with democracy and how we see them in America today. The first problem with democracy is wealth. The influence of wealth on politics is extreme and far-reaching. Big money in campaign finance and lobbying is tantamount to legalized corruption. The Citizens United versus the Federal Election Commission's Supreme Court case in 2010 had a huge impact on the role of money in U.S. politics. This case has so many possibilities for corruption. Citizens United essentially legalized a pay-for-play arrangement where corporations can buy elections in secret. It's even legal for dark money groups to offer candidates millions of dollars to drop out of a race, as described by 2024 Michigan Senate candidate Hill Harper. One of the consequences of Citizens United is the rise of the super PAC, which are organizations that can raise and spend unlimited amounts of money to support or oppose candidates. Super PACs have increased the influence of wealthy donors on corporations and elections. I'd like to show you a few images. This is a list of the top spending super PACs of all time. You can see the Chamber of Commerce and Crossroads GPS at the top. The Chamber of Commerce raises money from a wide variety of corporate donors and gives heavily to the Republican Party. Crossroads GPS is a 501c3 founded by Karl Rove. They have had significant influence in pushing a right-wing agenda in U.S. politics for many years. There's a significant lack of transparency when dealing with a super PAC. Super PACs are legally allowed to operate in secret. They're not required to disclose their donors, making it nearly impossible to track the source of political spending or campaign corruption. As is often the case when dealing with moneyed interests, there is no accountability for their actions when using a super PAC. Now, organizations can track the spending and some of the data used by super PACs. From this information, we can extrapolate some conclusions about the magnitude of their financial influence. Here are a few more images describing how much dark money is in politics. As seen here, super PAC money flowing into political campaigns has skyrocketed since the Citizens United decision in 2010. And here is some data about this year's election. Super PAC spending has absolutely surged, coming in at over $7 billion. The Federal Election Commission also reports over $7 billion in total super PAC funding to the 2024 U.S. presidential campaign. Wealth inequality can also limit a person's access to education and information, making it harder for people to understand complex political issues and make informed decisions about things that affect their lives. Inequality also undermines the rule of law. It leads to a two-tiered system of justice where the wealthy can use their resources to avoid accountability. The extreme wealth disparity in America today has created a system of unequal influence. The people are no longer represented. Corporations are. Wealthy individuals and corporations can significantly influence elections through campaign donations and lobbying. This can give them disproportionate power over policy decisions. The wealthy also have greater access to politicians and policymakers, allowing them to shape legislation and regulations in their favor. Another corporate interest shaping legislation is lobbying. Lobbyists are paid by corporations to lobby the government, in effect to influence the way laws are written. More than half of former Congresspeople become lobbyists paid by corporations to create laws in their favor. Here's just a small list of recent examples of Congresspeople becoming lobbyists. And in this chart, we can see that Congresspeople becoming lobbyists begins to surge after 1990. These lobbyists are paid exorbitant rates to influence Congresspeople to write laws that benefit corporations and wealth. Wealthy corporations have also bought up all of the major media outlets, shaping public opinion through biased reporting and propaganda. This can contribute to political polarization and hinder informed decision-making. In the 1980s, over 50 different media companies served Americans with a wide variety of information. The number of companies that own our media systems has dwindled to only 6. And we can see here that those big companies are Comcast, News Corp, Disney, Viacom, Time Warner, and CBS. When wealth is used to influence politics, the public loses trust in its democratic process. People start to feel that their voices are not being heard and that the system is rigged against them. So many reforms are needed to restrict the influence of money on politics. To fix these challenges, democracies should implement policies that promote economic equality, such as progressive taxation, strong social safety nets, and investments in education. We need reforms such as campaign finance regulations, more transparency in lobbying, and stronger media accountability. Additionally, promoting civic engagement and education can empower citizens to hold their elected officials accountable and participate meaningfully in the democratic process. The second problem with democracy is mob rule. Mob rule disregards the rule of law, putting the will of the crowd over established legal processes and institutions. This can lead to the erosion of individual rights and the breakdown of the social order. Mob rule can also result in the tyranny of the majority, where the rights and interests of minority groups are ignored or suppressed. This can lead to social injustice and political instability. During a state of political disorder, mob rule relies on emotional appeals and fear-mongering, rather than rational deliberation and evidence-based decision-making. This can lead to hasty and ill-considered actions that have negative consequences. When the will of the crowd takes precedence over the established procedures, these institutions can become ineffective and irrelevant. Mob rule can lead to violence and intimidation, as individuals and groups are targeted for their beliefs or affiliations. This can create a climate of fear and stifle dissent. A more organized form of mob rule is called domestic terrorism. Let's take a look at some numbers involving domestic terrorism. We can see the overwhelming majority of domestic terrorism is committed by right-wing extremists, with more than 3 times the number of terrorist plots than other groups. There's been a sharp rise in right-wing extremist terror attacks in recent years. From 2014 to 2020, we see a huge spike in violent far-right terrorism, easily outpacing everything else combined. This pie chart shows that half of all domestic terror plots are against demonstrators, showing an incredibly strong example of right-wing terrorism impacting the state of democracy. To protect democracy from the dangers of mob rule, it's essential to uphold the rule of law, to promote civil discourse, and to encourage critical thinking. Strong democratic institutions such as an independent judiciary and a free press are so important for making sure that the will of the people is expressed through legitimate and peaceful means. I also want to talk about a few historical examples of mob rule. Philosophy has talked about mob rule in democracy for centuries. Plato was deeply skeptical of democracy. He saw it as a form of government prone to instability and the tyranny of the majority. Plato argued that the passions of the masses could easily be manipulated by demagogues, leading into chaos and the erosion of individual rights. Aristotle was more optimistic about democracy than Plato, but he also recognized the dangers of mob rule. He distinguished between different forms of democracy, arguing that those who disregarded the rule of law could degenerate into ochlocracy. Ochlocracy is a term coined by Polybius, a Greek historian, to describe the pathological version of popular rule. He argued that mob rule could lead to the breakdown of social order and the rise of tyranny. And like Plato, the 18th century philosopher Edmund Burke was a critic of democracy. He argued that the passions of the masses could easily be manipulated by demagogues, leading to violence and the destruction of traditional institutions. Another historical example of mob rule is the storming of the U.S. Capitol on January 6, 2021. Right-wing extremist rioters took over the Capitol building, killing police officers and wounding hundreds. Their goal was to overturn a fairly held U.S. election, which is a clear example of mob rule. And going back in history, an example of mob rule is the French Revolution, which saw the use of mob violence to execute thousands deemed enemies of the revolution from 1789 to 1799. The third major problem with democracy is misinformation. Misinformation is like a plague on the minds of society. It undermines democracy's core principles by promoting widespread doubt about what truth is. Misinformation can sway public opinion and influence election outcomes. False or misleading information can be used to discredit candidates, spread fear, and manipulate voters. This image gives us a snapshot of how Americans think about misinformation in politics. Statistica tells us that 36% of these respondents have seen misinformation about politics in the news. Ipsos tells us that 64% of Americans think there is more lying in politics and media than there was 30 years ago. Misinformation can also erode public trust in institutions, media outlets, and elected officials. When people doubt the validity of information, they become more susceptible to conspiracy theories and extremist ideologues. For example, Fox News broadcasted a large amount of false information about the 2020 election. Dominion Voting Systems received a $787 million settlement from Fox News over broadcasting fraudulent information. False information can deepen social divisions by creating an echo chamber where people only hear information that confirms their existing beliefs. This can lead to more polarization and make it harder for people to find common ground. People can have a hard time making informed decisions about important issues due to misinformation. When people are exposed to false information, they may make choices that are not in their best interests. Examples of misinformation interfering with democracy include, after the 2020 U.S. presidential election, numerous false claims were spread about voter fraud and rigged voting machines, despite multiple recounts and investigations confirming that the results are correct. False cures, such as claims that various substances, such as bleach or hydroxychloroquine, could cure COVID-19. False. Altered images and videos are created and spread by domestic and foreign media outlets alike. To combat the negative effects of misinformation, we have to promote media literacy, fact-checking, and critical thinking skills. We also need to make sure that social media platforms take steps to reduce the spread of misinformation. Sometimes it can be hard to look past the flaws in democracy without rejecting the philosophy outright. Its problems can seem insurmountable, especially in the moments that you're facing them. It really is a type of faith that you have to have, that this set of ideas can endure the test of time, the test of fascism, and the test of the three problems that I've detailed here today in this video. Thank you for tuning in to another episode of The Issues with Nate Markham. Please like, subscribe, and share. We'll see you on the next episode.